Welcome to this lecture. It's about experimental prototyping and playtesting when you use iterative game design for the purpose of research. So, an overview of this talk. We're going to talk about the wicked problems and the importance of building when you want to understand the game design space. We're going to talk about different types of prototypes, different types of playtests, how you can obtain data from the playtests, and what kind of trade-offs you need to keep in mind during the process of doing this type of work. So the background of this talk is that me and the researcher at Nokia, Elina Ollila, last spring, we wrote this paper. It's called Design for Results, Considerations for Experimental Prototyping and Playtesting, using iterative game design. The reason for doing that was that there's lots and lots of literature about how you prototype and test to make the best game ever possible. But there's not so much data when you use the similar method in order to gain new knowledge about certain features or certain types of research questions, when that is the success criteria to find answers to your questions rather than make the best game ever. And since both me and Elina has worked a lot in this area, we thought that, okay, let's sit down and write down what we know. This paper is going to be published in a journal called Simulation and Gaming in a special issue on game research methods, but it's not out yet. But for those who are interested, it's on the course web, and you can also ping me by email and I'll send it over until it's published. So the focus on this talk is going to be the whole process of how you can gain data during this process. So, but let's start with some base definition. What is a prototype? The most common definition is usually taken from Zalen and Zimmerman's book, where a prototype is described as something which is played, evaluated, adjusted, and played again, allowing the designer or design team to base decisions on the successive iterations or versions of the game. And also iterative design being this kind of cyclic process where you do some prototyping, you go back, consider it, what was good, what was bad, so that you know this before you do the real final implementation. By doing this, you gain a lot of time, so you don't spend unnecessary time doing things that doesn't work. You know that already, what's going to work and what's not going to work, design-wise. And in our case, regarding how you get new knowledge about your research question. So, early questions in this process, I mean, they are different for each project. But, for example, you might ask yourself what type of gameplay dynamics a certain feature can result in. By looking at this, when I talk about dynamics, I'm taking that from the MDA model by Unicke that most of you are familiar with, which talks about you have the game mechanics, and then when it's played, you have what happens is that the game gets its dynamics, and then you have an aesthetic experience of that. And that's the ultimate goal. What kind of aesthetic experience do you want to have? You might ask yourself about these dynamics, the play experience and the aesthetics. How can it be documented? How can it be explained? And how can you interpret this in order to give knowledge to other people with similar questions? Also, how do you know that it's good? How do you prove to someone else that it's good if you find it good? What type of data do you need in order to prove something like this? If the experience is better, how is it better? Better according to whom? Is it a certain type of segment of players that find it better? Some players might not find that. And which are these? What are your target groups? And what do these things? Something what sometimes happens if you do very innovative research is that there isn't really other games that you can compare with. To say that if you do something completely new that doesn't exist, how can you compare it to something else then? Well, that's when you really need to get down to the playtesting and show what is new and how players react to this. And in order to do this, you need to carefully consider what type of data you need from your playtests and from your participants in these playtests. So, a little word of warning. This whole process, we are so used to creating the best game ever that once you get cracking on the development, it's very easy for everybody, even if everybody knows that you're out to get this kind of answer, that you really want to make the best game ever, and that's fine. It's good if you also make the best game ever. But don't forget the focus of really getting these answers as you do this. It's a very common thing to fall into. So my advice during this process is to regularly take a step back, even if you're kind of in the middle of the development frenzy and you need to make this demo because you need to show it at some kind of venue. Take a step back, just 15 minutes, and think, I didn't forget the research question now, did I? Just try to remember this and do that every now and then. Wicked problems. That's a term that comes from social planning, urban planning, when you have really big problems. A wicked problem, that's the definition of it, is that when you try to produce a solution, you have the solution, and the solution just creates new problems. I think that this is something that many people in game development are quite familiar with. In game design, there's a great paper by Michael Matthias and Andrew Stern from 2005 when they apply this on game design. Basically, what they say is that game design, in many cases, especially when you do innovative things, it is a wicked problem. And you need to know that and just realize that, yes, it is difficult, but you will be able to get through it as long as you try to be as systematic as possible and not panic. And it is something, when you explore new spaces, there isn't really a set route. You need to find the route to explore this design space. And the design space is what you build. In the same paper by Matthias and Stern, that's one of my favorite papers because they really push the importance of building prototypes. Because you can look at existing games and you can learn a lot, but if you want to explore new things that doesn't exist, well, you really need to build it. Because otherwise there's nothing to study. So, in this talk, I'm going to attempt to give a navigational aid in this wicked problem space. So, the rest of the talk, we will first talk about different types of prototypes. Then we're going to talk about different type of playtests that can be applied to these different type of prototypes. And then we're going to talk about different ways of obtaining data from these playtests. So, here we go. In the early stages, there are a couple of methods that are good to use before you do any kind of prototyping at all. Usually this is called sketching, that you have sketches. You can try to enact it by body storming. The participants, usually the developers or the design team, try to enact the prototype, the game, as if it already existed. You can use mock-ups and stuff like that, but this is a really quick and dirty way of doing it. I haven't used this myself. Elina has used it a lot. Oh, by the way, the references which are in this talk, everything is in the paper which is in the course web. So here is just, as you can see here, it's just the author names and the year, but you can find it there. I didn't write everything out here. Another method is to use video scenarios, so that you make video scenarios, and these are good when you need to communicate a design idea to the rest of the team, to a potential buyer of the game, or to a research body that you need to get when you need the resources, and you need to communicate it both to people supporting your work, and also the people that are going to work with you, and also to get the understanding of it yourself. Something which is important is that these prototyping tools, the prototypes, they are tools for thinking. They are, see them as your method of thinking more clearly, more specifically about the dynamics and the mechanics of what you build. Paper prototypes. I know that everybody here are very familiar with that because you do that a lot in this education. Physical prototypes, they can be paper mock-ups. You can use different types of devices to try to test your gameplay. This is a picture of a game prototype I made a couple of years ago, where people, this is kind of in the end of the test where all the scenarios are there. People started here, and then there were different scenarios here, and all these are different types of tokens that was used in the playtest. Then, in order to try out complex game mechanics, it's not always enough to just do it with paper and do on-the-fly calculations. You might want some computational aid. And just using simple Excel charts is a really simple and cheap and quick and easy method of doing computations along with the playtests. So that if you have, for example, board games where you're rolling die and have some types of dependencies, what happens? You have your Excel sheet that you use as calculation for that for each round. You can also use more advanced methods, such as this is the Microsoft Surface table. There is an implementation called Raptor that was published this year at Future Play. It's a tool for game sketching, so that you can make easy kind of mock-up tests for certain genres of games, where you can use calculations and pick objects, stamp new objects, create environments, and have a view of that, both on this kind of physical plane there, and also see it on a computer screen, as it would look like if it was just a common PC game. Software prototypes, of course, in the late stages of the game, when you try features when they're almost done, but where you haven't put all the content in. Doesn't have to be always in the late stages. There are good kind of fast prototyping programming tools as well, Flash or more specified tools for this. So here is an example of a production cycle. We will go back to this one in the end, but now I'm just going to give an overview of a potential process. We'll try hard to not make this look like a waterfall model. So it really needs to start with the research question. When you have the research question, you can start doing the early design. You can do sketches, early software prototyping, body storming. You can have scenarios, game-mastered scenarios in your paper prototypes. You need to consider what type of prototypes are best for your specific question. And you need to have a process where you kind of go in between these types of prototyping, where you start quick and then you set things more and more in software, in case that you're doing a game, a software game, of course. So let's look at different types of playtests. One of the absolute mostly simple ones is just when you have your paper prototype or an idea, and you just grab someone in the corridor, someone who is not part of the same project, and you just quickly try out things. This is something that doesn't need to be formalized at all. You just grab someone and see, does this work? It can be small, it can be large, it can be all these kind of things. Don't discard the simple, quick ways. These are usually the best ones in the early stages. Another type of early test is the focus tests. That's when you take a group of people in your target group, you put them in a room, and you ask them questions, and you let them discuss also among themselves, and you listen to what they say. It can be, you have your questions, how do I best build something? Is my personality model for the avatars too complex, for example? Or what level of control is good? It totally depends on your research question. Another good test is the expert evaluation. That's when you have come, you show what you have to someone who is an expert in a field. If you have a mock-up of an MMO game, you ask one or two experienced MMO designers, what do you think about this? They can probably really quickly spot simple mistakes that you don't need to make them. And independent on how experienced you are yourself, it's really useful to get another expert perspective. Then we have the quality assurance test, or the functional test. That's usually finding the bugs. And that doesn't only have to be software bugs, it's also design bugs when you see that something is unbalanced. You play the game in whatever form it is, and you find all the things that makes either the prototype unstable from a technical perspective, and you find the glitches in the balancing of your game design. Then, a very fun type of test is the participatory design. That's when you have people that you trust. It can be experts, it can be beginners, and you sit together, you go through the play test together, and you don't only just monitor how they react and what they do, you also invite them to come with ideas about how to make the game better. You don't have to listen to everything, but you might find some really good things coming out of this. Then, guided scenarios. These can be conducted when you have paper prototypes and when you have software prototypes. This is really useful to do before you start the heavy software implementation. You just pretend that you have all the software in place. So that someone, this is here, is a picture from a playtest I did together with some people. This is Elina from Nokia, and this guy is from Sony, and this is our player. So what we did here, that we had a paper mock-up. Elina, she was the game master, so she said, okay, now you're entering to this room, this and this happens. What do you do? Every time the player did something, here, he was the engine. So he did all the calculations with Excel sheets, and he said, this is the result. I'm not in the picture. I was the manual. So he could, every time he felt unsure, he could ask me about the game rules. And then I could answer him as if I was a manual. And this was done before any kind of implementation was done in the software. All we had was a paper mock-up. And we got really good data from this, knowing what to implement and what not to implement. Once you have a software prototype, but you don't have any content in it, you just have the game mechanics, then you can use game master play sessions. That you can write up a scenario. Instead of having NPCs, for example, if you make a role-playing game, giving the player quests, you go in there as your own avatar and you act as if you were an NPC, giving out quests, for example, and then tagging along, giving advice, game mastering. That's also something which gives you a better view of the game mechanics that you have. This can be, this is really good to combine with the functional tests as well. So you do the kind of Wizard of Ozing type, but not for the functionality, but basically for the game mastering and content handling. Free-form play sessions. This is perhaps an unfortunate term. What we mean by this is basically when you have your software prototype, if it's a software prototype, and you just, it can be a board game as well, and you just put the player together with the game, and you don't do anything. You just monitor what is happening. Where does the player get stuck? Where doesn't it work? If you're in the industry at this point, you might want to send off your the version that you have, the alpha or the beta, to a testing consultant along with the script of what that person is supposed, what needs to be tested, along with instructions about the target group. That's where you don't have any control of it yourself. So this is a summary, the practical considerations that you can make for the type of play tests to do. So here, this is divided into the type of play test, what people you need to have around in order to do the play test, and approximately when in the production cycle you can do it. So these ad hoc tests, where you just find someone in the corridor and snag them and get them to play your prototype, whatever format it's in. That can be someone which is part of the team, or a colleague, or a consultant, someone that you just find. This is done really early in the process, usually. The participatory design workshops, the same here. They can be part of the team, they can be colleagues, they can be consultants, they can be external experts. This is also something done early. The quality assurance, the function tests, of course, needs to be different depending on your stage, if you're looking at game balancing or software bugs. Again, it can be done by members of the team, can be done by colleagues and consultants. You might not want to have players actually doing this. And you do that along the way, usually kind of in the middle stage of the development process. The expert evaluations, these can be done early and in the medium, perhaps not too late. It's usual as well, but too late in the process, perhaps you won't be able to make so big changes. So, these were when you use expert, you use colleagues, and you use your team. But when you need to pull in players from the different types of target groups that are interesting for your games, this is in the focus test. When you take a group of people, you put them in a room and you discuss different aspects of your game design. That's when you need to find your target group people. This is can also be done very early in the process. The guided scenarios, the game mastered play sessions, and the freeform play sessions. Obviously, you need players to do that. Members of the team, colleagues and consultants doesn't have the kind of clean slate that you need in order to get the results. That's also something to think about. If you're in a smaller environment and you know that you're not going to have that many people to ask to be your playtesters, make sure that you don't give them information on a daily basis about the development of your game, because if they know too much about it when they come to the playtest, they won't really be able to give good answers because they know too much. You want to have players who have never seen the game before. Okay, so that was the types of playtests. Now, how can you obtain data from the playtests? One common method, a good method, is to use surveys. That's basically to have a set of questions and players can answer yes or no, or write in free form, or rate things along a scale about what attitude they have to a certain aspect of your game or your game feature. This is a method that doesn't require that much effort from you, except from doing the actual survey and having the people, because when people fill it in, well, they do the job of filling it in. Then you just need to analyze the data. This is an example where surveys are used as the only tool. This is the Daedalus project web page by Nick Yee. He's been for many, many years done research on players who play MMOs. So he's had a large number of players fill in different types of surveys. At this point, 35,000 players, which is a good base for getting knowledge about certain questions. And he's been doing things about what kind of motivations for play do people have. And he's kind of taking this together with looking at demographical data. Can look at gender differences, age differences on what motivates people to play. So I recommend, for looking at surveys and how you can design surveys, have a look at the Daedalus project and fill in some of the forms to get an understanding of how you can use this as a tool for your own playtests. Interviews, however, you can say that this is a qualitative method using interviews, while surveys is a quantitative method. It takes long time to do interviews because you do them one-on-one, but it's really good because in a survey you have a fixed set of questions. In an interview you have a conversation. So if someone says, the person that you're interviewing says something interesting, you can ask follow-up questions on that. So a good method is to start out with having a couple of interviews, really long interviews, and see what type of questions that emerge from that, and then use that when you do your surveys to get better types of questions. Another thing, reason that it can be good to combine interviews and surveys is that if you have done a playtest and then interview the player about that, most players want to make you feel good about your game. So they might not be totally honest. They might say that it's better than it really is. But if you have an anonymous survey, then they usually say what's actually there. But by the way, that's the thing when it comes to interviews after a playtest. It's important to tell the player that don't be nice. I want to know what doesn't work. Don't spare me. That's why you're doing the test. So this is a picture from a tool called Transana. Here I have made a playtest, and afterwards I'm asking the player questions, and here she is answering my questions and reasoning about the gameplay. Here, this is a verbatim transcription, that is, each word is written down, what she says. And after this, it's possible, when you have gone through all the interviews, to see patterns. And then use keywords so that you can quantify what is happening in the interviews. For example, here, the playtest that I did focused on emotions here, and she is reasoning about that. And what I could see here was that my sample, I had 10 players. Most of them, they tended to concentrate to talk about the same emotions. They talked about distress, anguish, they talked about joy, which led to me that I needed to look at, was it the design of the test that made it so that they talked a lot about these emotions? Or was it the game itself? And then I needed to break that down in order to understand the data that I had, in order to make it useful. Another really good method that you can also have in combination with both interviews and surveys is teach-back tasks. That is when you ask someone who has just made the test, who have tried your prototype, to describe the gameplay to someone else. Because then you get an understanding about how the player thinks that the system works. So then you understand, did they understand it or did they not? If you have a playtest and they describe it to someone else as something that it wasn't supposed to be, well, then you know that you need to make some changes. For example, in the test that was here, I asked the players, because I had a feature called the mood of the player, and I wanted to know how the players thought that the mechanics worked, if they were depressed, for example, or harmonic. So I asked them to describe, okay, so if you describe to your best friend how mood works in this game, how is it? And then I got these explanations of how they thought that it worked. Lucky for me, most of them were spot on, but I did see some things that I needed to change in the instructions. And this is also a kind of economic method because it's the player, again, does the work, and you can use it in an interview, or you can use it also as a survey question. Ask people to, in free-form text, describe how something works in your game. It's not always necessary to videotape the interactions, but it can be good to do that. And once you start videotaping, you might find interesting stuff, and if you do, that's good. For example, if people make very kind of gestures, instead of just saying that, yes, this was fun, if you can see in the body language that they really found it fun, that's kind of more proof of concept. This is from the playtest where we had the kind of engine game master manual kind of thing, and she just won a boss fight there. So that's also something that when you do analyze your data, you can, I mean, first of all, you can make this verbatim transcription, write down exactly what everybody says, but you can also see that you can count gesture, you can count smiles, you can count when people are playing, when do they smile, what do they find fun, when do they get frustrated. You can see that in the body language, and you can see patterns in that. Something which is used more and more in playtest now is biofeedback. For different types of devices, you can have that. This is, I mean, you can have eye tracking. That's when you track what people look at the screen. If there are lots of objects that you see that no one ever looks at, and they are important, well, then you know that you might want to make a change in the design. Heart rate variability, that's how fast the heart beats. If people get excited, it tends to beat faster. That can also be interesting to know when this happens. The galvanism, that is basically sweat, and temperatures in fingers. That also says a lot about people's reactions to games. If they start to get nervous, they sweat, and if they get cold, that's usually a sign of fear. EEG, there are devices now that this has been seen usually as a quite rough way of looking at it. I mean, you can see certain levels of distress and pleasure, and but not much more. Now there are devices. This is Andreas Wahlman, who is a teacher here at Gotland University, trying on the emotive headset, which is something that we're going to use. And that can track both what kind of areas that are active in the brain, and it also measures, well, he didn't put it on right here, the muscle contractions. For example, if someone has a real smile, then the muscles here move. If it's a smile, a polite smile, when you do it in a conversation to kind of show that you're happy, then these muscles don't move. So that's also something. Personally, I'm interested to use this as a kind of driver for gameplay rather than just something for testing, but it's really useful for testing as well. Another type of thing is a posture sensor. This is basically a butt sensor. This is something that you put on the chair, and you can see how people move around on the chair. If they get frustrated, they tend to move around a lot. If they're really concentrated, they sit still. All these things can be useful when you test your game. Another way of obtaining data is data mining. Well, this usually involves a software prototype when you have logs of player behaviors, what they do. Chat logs, count which spells they use in what circumstances, if you have spells that is, what type of actions that they do, if there are patterns in the actions. Here it's really important to decide on which types of interactions to log. Depending on your processing power, you might not be able to log everything. So when you log it, make sure that you have different levels of logging so that you don't clog the computer and everything breaks down in the middle of the test. This is an example from Microsoft Labs. They did, when they did Halo 3, they used data mining to check the different levels of Halo. There was an article in Wired 2007, and they have been continuing this work since then. They used heat maps for it. This picture is new. I got it from John Hobson at Microsoft just 2 months ago. So this is quite a new picture. This shows a level of Halo where all these little dots mark that a player died in this particular spot in the geography. And the color codes designate the cause of death. And as it is now, they haven't mapped this to videotapes of expression, but they are thinking of doing that. So that's a really, I mean, if you can see that everybody dies in the same spot, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, your design is the answer of that. But it's a very powerful tool. So when you process the data, again, as in many of these considerations to make, it's a matter of how much time and resources do you have. For example, do you have time and resources to make a rough coding scheme of certain types of utterances, when players mention things, when they do certain gestures? In the picture I showed you from the Transana where I had a player, I made a coding scheme where I made an annotation for every time they mentioned the emotions that were part of the gameplay, 13 different emotions, and then I could have a kind of quantitative count of how many times something was mentioned, and then I could use that as a base for my analysis. Verbatim transcriptions, that is, writing down exactly word for word what the player says, that takes time, and it's really boring. It's also extremely useful, but depending on where you are in your process, you might be doing an overkill if you decide to do transcriptions of everything. In other circumstances, it's necessary and really good stuff come out of it. But again, it's a trade-off of time and resources. All the resources you put on something needs to be taken from the whole of your game project. So, again here, if you trace and describe the actions of players in relation to a prototype, that's also something that takes time. Making patterns of that is also relates to data mining. To what level do you use that? In which granularity do you make your data processing? Because this is man hours that you're putting in, or person hours. For example, it would be great if there was a kind of video software processing that could just count all the smiles that the player has. But to date, there is no real good software that can do that type of annotation on the fly. So then you have to sit manually, and the more subjects you have, the more tests you have done, the more time you need to put into processing the data. So always the trade-off of time. So, obtaining data. This is a summary of all these different types of methods. So, when you're going to obtain the data, do you ask the players? How do you ask them? Do you use surveys or do you use interviews? When you observe players, what do you observe? Do you look at the choice of actions, the patterns of action, what they actually do in the game? Do you look at their expressions, their body language, their facial expression, etc.? Do you measure, do you take their biofeedback? Do you annotate that? When you capture the data, when surveys is easy, you just get them, you get the survey forms, and if you have a good survey tool, it can do a lot of the statistic analysis for you. When it comes to interviews, I mean, sometimes it's enough with just taking notes, just that you have someone in the team taking notes on that. Or you can just have tape recording, or you can have videotaping. When you observe the players, here also, do you videotape the player, the full body, or just the face with a webcam? Do you use a video capture software on the computer, such as Camtasia, to look at what happens on the screen, the actions? Do you log significant actions and then use some kind of filtering or data processing to get that statistics out? For the expressions, videotaping, or you can do sound recording. There's a lot of good work done on how you can analyze the pitch and voice and how fast people speak. That can also say a lot. And when it comes to the biodata, the physiological responses, that can also be done by note-taking. If you sit by you're testing things and just take notes, or you make sure that you store the logs from the different types of devices. If you use a lot, it can be a good idea to write the software that merges all these channels in real time, so that you know that at the same time as someone has a facial expression, this happens in the body, and that you can have a picture of that, so that you don't need to sit, okay, I have player 34 and the time code 34:45. She smiled, and I wonder what her heart rate was at that exact point. It can be good to have that as a source together. So, once you have your data, when you process it, first of all, you don't have to analyze everything. Find the really interesting portions and analyze those. Again, a trade-off of time, of how much. If you have, for example, 10 playtest hours to look at, and only half an hour of that is interesting, focus on that half hour. Then the transcriptions and annotations, level of detail. What is interesting? If you do an overkill, well, yeah, then you have to have a trade-off of something else in the project. Synchronization, if you have a lot, the more you have, the more work is going to be to synchronize the data to make sense of it. So that's also a reason for limiting the channels of data. And also pinpointing the ones that are relevant for your research questions. Yes. This is a slide from the last talk. You remember the slide from Halo? That's John Hopkins who gave it to me. He had to have clearance from the management and had to write a couple of emails. Had to know the exact context where it was going to be used. He's not free to share the knowledge without clearance. He has to know if it's okay to do that. When they do the playtests, they need to do it in order to make Halo better. That is the reason for doing these types of playtests. That's their success criteria. There's a huge difference in the area. Even though we have similar goals and passions in the industry and the research of getting a greater understanding, making better games, in research you don't have the same types of researchers, but you do have the freedom of choosing your subject area, what type of research that you are going to do. But as you do that, you also need to make sure that when you do your research, you need to validate it, because that is your key to be able to keep doing it. To make good research, have a good testing process that really shows something that you can share. And when you do find your data, you really have to share it, because that's how the research field progresses. So it's also important to make sure that when you write about your research, that it is accessible and clear to people, so that so that there is meaning to the process. So, we talked about the wicked problem space of game design. When you start navigating this, always start with the research question. That has to be the basis. You start with that. Then you think about what kind of prototype can best answer this question. Here, you need to make affordances for the time limits that you have, also how large your group is, and also what knowledge your group has. You can't make a game that your team doesn't know how to make. You need to take all these things into account. Also, once you have your research question and you have decided what type of prototype, you need to design and think about what type of test you can do to get data, to get answers to your questions. What tests to make. Here, again, take into consideration how much time you have, how rigorous that test can be. Also think about what type of players you have around you. Is it easy or difficult for you to find test subjects or test participants of your target group? That's also important, because setting up tests, that's also kind of organizational work that takes time. Also, if you do something with new devices, that can also have a limitation factor. If you, for example, use a type of technology where you're using prototypes that doesn't only exist and you only have 3 technological devices, that's also a constraining factor. So important to take that into plan. Then, when you process the data, again, the affordances are important. Of course, we want to make as detailed and rigorous as possible, but it also needs to be humanly possible to come to a conclusion of the project. So when you process, if you really don't have much time, then you can have surveys. If you have a software prototype that needs tons and tons of implementation, perhaps you need to settle with surveys. On the other hand, if you're trying out the test idea and not doing a software prototype, but this really cool paper prototype, which is a proof of concept, then you might want to put more resources into the testing to really study the players interacting with that, and then say that, yes, now we can go on to the next stage and make a software prototype, if that is the goal. So, this concludes my lecture.